Let's talk about the government's flagship welfare reform, universal credit. Last week on this show, the Labour Party position changed from pause and fix to scrapping it altogether. The benefit combines 6 separate payments into one and aims to ensure that work pays and people don't become trapped on welfare. And while the concept has been welcomed largely, its execution has had a few teething problems. Well, joining us to discuss all of this is the Shadow Attorney General, Baroness Chakrabarti. Thanks for being with us.
Pleasure.
I want to start off with universal credit. Last week, John McDonnell, the Shadow Chancellor, said that it will have to go, effectively saying that Labour's position would be to get rid of it. What I'm a little bit unclear about is what you'd like to replace it with.
Well, can I just say, I know you described the position as changing from pause and fix to scrapping, and I understand that dramatic language will make you think that this is a complete change of policy, but in the end, people need to be supported when they're out of work, when they're on low-paid work. They need to be supported in a number of ways, including via benefits. So whether you end up changing the name of a benefit or changing the structure of a benefit, in the end, what's important is the end of austerity and people having the money that they need to live, to stay alive in the 6th wealthiest economy on earth.
So are you saying that Labour might not scrap universal credit?
What I'm saying is that I don't think universal credit in its current form is sustainable, and that's why we're urging the government to stop the rollout now, because it's causing such hardship to people. The idea, the theoretical idea that you could have one simple benefit rather than people having to apply for lots of benefits always appealed to me in theory. The problem with universal credit as it now is under this government is that it's being used to cut people's benefits, to penalise people for having too many children, to penalise the disabled and other vulnerable people. So the notion of a simpler benefit system, great idea, but not if you're adding austerity to it.
So if are you saying then that if enough money was put into universal credit, you'd actually be happy to see it stay?
Well, personally, I think that the term universal credit is now such a toxic brand that it would be very hard to rebuild trust in it. But we are talking with the people who've been affected. We're talking with the charities who have been trying to paper over the cracks and support some of the most vulnerable people in society, including via food banks. We're working with them, talking with them to try and work out the most practical way to make things better. And if you contrast what we're trying to do, working with civil society, with what the government's doing, including gagging clauses into contracts that the government has with charities and other third parties, I think that's a very, very different approach.
The gagging clauses in particular, something that you're concerned about?
Well, you know, as Shadow Attorney, you can imagine, and with a human rights and free speech background, you can imagine that I was pretty shocked to learn that contracts between the DWP, that's Esther McVeigh's department, and charities include clauses that preclude the charities from criticising the Secretary of State, the department, or universal credit. That's completely unacceptable, and I think quite possibly unenforceable in our courts. So Margaret Greenwood has written to Esther McVeigh, urging her to come to Parliament and make very publicly clear that these gagging clauses will not be enforced, and they will not continue in any new contracts between government and third parties.
Now, lots of things to discuss on the programme. Before we get to some of the other issues, I am keen to talk to you about anti-Semitism, because you, of course, authored the report into anti-Semitism. Over the summer, we've had several stories, allegations coming forward about alleged anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. So I'm quite keen to talk to you about some of those with your report for reference. So I think we can look at something that you wrote in your report, which is this. It's always incendiary to compare the actions of Jewish people or institutions to those of Hitler or the Nazis. Now, in 2013, Jeremy Corbyn, it emerged over the summer, said that Palestinians in the West Bank live under occupation of the very sort that would be recognised by many people in Europe who suffered occupation during the Second World War. So by your definition, that would be incendiary. Was that right? Well,
incendiary, by the way, doesn't mean anti-Semitic.
No, quite.
So let me put it like this. By the time I was looking at the nature of discourse within the party, by definition, we had a problem that needed to be addressed. And I was trying to set down some guidelines for people who want to make very important arguments, but not make them in a way that is going to just automatically get people's backs up.
And I understand that
So
this is before your report,
Yeah,
but
no,
would you say those comments were insensitive?
I think that I stand by my advice to everybody, which is to make your human rights critiques. And Jeremy, like me, is a lifelong human rights defender, and he is quite right to draw people's attention to the plight of the Palestinians. But I think that it is better, if possible, given the rise of the far right, given the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe, it is better to make those human rights arguments without comparison to the Nazis.
Now, in another section, you talk about Jewish stereotyping and anti-Semitic conspiracy tropes, and you say this about that. I'm not saying that this is endemic, but any seasoned activist who says that they are completely unaware of any such discourse must be wholly insensitive or completely in denial. And I just want to talk to you about Peter Wilsman, re-elected to the National Executive Committee, who was recorded saying that he's never seen any anti-Semitism in the party. So is he insensitive or in denial, do you think?
Well, I don't know, but I stand by what I said, which is there's been a real issue. And I do understand that some people will say that they've not personally experienced it. Well, guess what? If you're not Jewish, you're not going to necessarily personally experienced it, and maybe you have been insensitive to it, or you know, maybe it's just you're speaking for your own personal experience. But the thing about racism of any kind, or frankly misogyny or any other kind of discrimination or hate, the thing about it is that you've got to try and listen to the broader experience. You've got to try to understand things that you've not experienced yourself.
Would you be happier?
That was what I was trying to advocate then and continue to advocate now.
Would you feel more comfortable if he hadn't been re-elected to the Executive Committee?
Possibly, you know, but he has apologised, and people have to have the opportunity to reflect and learn and change and be more sensitive and become aware of other people's experience. As Jeremy Corbyn said at conference, and by the way, that was a conference of, you know, sort of 15,000 people who came together in this democratic moment and generally speaking behaved quite well with each other. He said we need to learn to listen more and shout less. And that, I think, is a crucial point, not just in the Labour Party, but in British politics and politics more generally. That's what I would advocate.
Now, you're, of course, the Shadow Attorney General, so justice and kind of legal affairs, if you like, are your brief. So I'm interested to get your thoughts on the case of Karen White, who was the transgender prisoner, convicted rapist, who was moved into a women's prison where she then committed sexual assault. Now, she's been sentenced now to life in prison. Should she spend the rest of her sentence in a male prison or a female prison, do you think?
So here's my position on the trans woman issue. I do believe in self-identification, but nonetheless, there are some people who should not be incarcerated together. Now, there's a wealth of case law from the Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, for example, about racists who have been put in prison cells with members of minority communities. Now, they might be of the same sex, and therefore they're in the right prison, you would say, but those two people should never have been put in a cell together because that would make one inherently vulnerable.
So it's more about her previous convictions rather about the gender that she identifies as?
I think there are some people who should not be housed together, whether in a refuge, whether in a women's refuge or whether in a women's prison, or in other vulnerable settings.
So should the Ministry of Justice policy be updated then? At the minute it's saying that transgender prisoners should be located in the part of the estate consistent with the gender they identify with.
I think that you've just got to be more specific than that. Some people are a danger to other particular people and they should not be housed or put in refuge or put in prison together. These are common sense, administrative, practical, responsible solutions to people's vulnerability. It's not about whether a trans woman is a woman like me or a woman like you. It's much more specific, I think.
Before the end of the interview, I'm also very keen to get your thoughts on Jamal Khashoggi, who is the journalist who has not been seen after entering the Saudi consulate in Turkey. Very concerning story, clearly. What do you think the UK government needs to do now?
I think we need to be much more robust. I mean, Emily Thornberry, our Shadow Foreign Secretary, has written in The Observer today a very robust piece about how we need to start calling out Saudi Arabia. I'm not saying that it's just the Conservative government. You know, Robin Cook was heartbroken about not being able to follow through on ethical foreign policy, largely because of things like arms sales to the Middle East. And we've got to start being more consistent in our criticisms of other governments. And as Emily's written today, you know, would the government be quite so reticent if this kind of behaviour were being conducted by Iran, Russia, other countries? Possibly not.
And so are you talking about like stopping arms sales, sanctions? What?
Potentially. I mean, you know, we cannot be arming Saudi Arabia without real assurances that those arms are not being used against innocent civilians in Yemen, against dissidents in Saudi Arabia itself. You know, Saudi Arabia should be in the dock when it comes to human rights abuses, including women's rights abuses on this planet, and we need to be more consistent in our attitude to human rights.
Okay, Baroness Chakrabarti, thank you very much.